So probably one of everybody's favorite moving baits is going to be a chatterbait. There's probably no better moving bait that's used across the world than this chatterbait. And it doesn't matter what brand or what size you like to throw, but I feel like there's 4 things that guys do wrong with a chatterbait that are keeping them from getting bites or causing them to lose bites that I want to break down today. So stick around, you do not want these to be your problems. So the 4th and final mistake that I see guys making is going to be one that is going to be really, really obvious, but most people do not ever think about. And it's my favorite thing that I see guys doing wrong, is throwing really old chatterbaits. And I don't mean old in the functionality of it. What I mean is, most baits you can change the hooks. Chatterbaits have one hook, and that's the only hook it's got. You can't just unscrew it and screw another one in. And so I have buddies that'll come out in the boat with me and they'll throw a chatterbait and lose fish and go, man, I don't know why I'm losing fish on this chatterbait. And I'm like, well, how long ago did you buy that chatterbait, right? And so if you have an old chatterbait that's in your boat that you pull out of the cup of the boat or that you had in your box for forever and there's a little bit of rust on the hook, you are probably going to want to ditch that one and buy a new one, because having a sharp hook on your chatterbait is absolutely key. And it's not key for little fish, because little fish, when they eat it, you can hook them right in the lip. They have smaller mouths, and so that hook catches a lot easier. Where you're going to struggle is going to be with your bigger fish, because like I talked about earlier, those bigger fish, when they bite onto a bait, can really have a lot of holding pressure on that. So when you set the hook, if you don't have a sharp hook to catch, sometimes that dull hook will just ride its way out, barely get a hold of its lip, and when that fish jumps one time, your chatterbait's going to come flying out, and then you're just going to be left speechless going, I don't know why it got off. I got a good hook set, I was fighting it really good. It's because your chatterbait was dull. So problem number 1 and problem number 2 kind of go hand in hand. Problem number 1 and problem number 2 is going to be the rod and the reel. That is something that I see guys have wrong right off the bat. I see guys using the wrong rod and the wrong reel. And so I'll have all my stuff linked down below as always, but there's really no right and no wrong rod and reel. The problem is when guys pair the wrong rod with the wrong reel, or the right rod with the wrong reel, you have to have the right action and the right gear ratio reel that's going to go hand in hand. So I'll break it down like this. If you like fishing a chatterbait with a more moderate cranking style rod, you need to have a little bit faster gear ratio reel. Because when those fish eat that bait, most oftentimes they come from behind it and come up and push that bait forward. And I've seen so many guys lose big fish on chatterbaits simply because those fish come up and jump once and come off. And the reason is they can't catch up fast enough to get a good hook set on those fish before that fish pops off, because they come flying out of the water and shake it. Those big fish especially, when they eat a bait, they have so much holding power on there that you have to get tight to those fish and be able to lean on them before they jump so you can actually get hook penetration, or else they're never even going to get the hook. And so if you like using a stiffer rod, then you need to go with a slower action reel. And the reason for that is, if you like a stiffer rod, those fish will come up and eat it, and you will feel them too soon. And if you set the hook too soon and reel into them, a lot of times you end up skin hooking those fish and have the exact same problem, where those fish jump one time, or you just lose them fighting them back to the boat. And so you really have to be aware of the right rod and the right reel that go together. I like a 7.4 Arc Invoker Pro. It's a medium heavy moderate action rod. And what it is it has a nice soft tip but good backbone, and it's almost like the perfect balance between a stiff rod and a soft rod. I pair that with a 7:1 gear ratio reel. Now if you like to run a more moderate action rod like I do, you could even go from a 7:1 to an 8:1, anywhere in that area. If it's easy for you to slow down, then you can try it. I like to have a pretty fast pace when I reel those baits in. It's just how I like to work. So that's why I go with the 7:1. If you run a stiffer rod, the fastest I would go would be a 7:1. I might even go to a 6.3:1 or a 6.4:1 if you like running a stiffer rod. But again, it just depends on how your hook set is. Do you like to absolutely jack them, or do you like to just lean on them? If you like to just lean on them, stiff rod might be your best bet. But if you like to really jack on them, that moderate action rod might be better suited for you, so you don't pull it out of the fish's mouth. It almost dummy proofs it. And those of you guys that like to lean on them, a stiff rod might be in your best benefit, because then you're not going to not get a hook set in them. This way, if you have a stiffer rod, you can lean on them and reel, and you have a stiff enough rod that it puts the hook home for you. So that was problem number 1 and number 2. Let's move on to problem number 3. So the third problem that I see guys having is they're actually running the wrong line size for what they're trying to do with the chatterbait. And you wouldn't think that would be a common problem, but it really is. The line that I generally try to run is 15-pound fluorocarbon, somewhere in that specific instant, somewhere in that range. Now, where I see guys going wrong is they fish either like 20-pound when they're fishing deeper, and so what ends up happening is their chatterbait rides up much higher in the water column and they don't get the actual depth out of that chatterbait that they want. Or I see guys running 10 to 12 pound when they're fishing up shallower. Now the only time that I've ever run 10-pound test was when I was fishing a BFL as a boater and I had a co-angler in the back and I was fishing isolated pieces of cover with a chatterbait, and what I was doing was keeping the boat just far enough away that my co-angler couldn't cast to it because he was casting 20-pound. And so that was the only time that I've ever used 10-pound, and I was only fishing around really sparse cover, so I knew breaking fish off wouldn't be a problem. But that's one thing that I see guys do too often, is they use too light of pound test and break fish off, or they use too heavy a pound test, and what that heavy pound test will actually do is it takes away from the action of your bait, which is something that I bet most of you guys probably never thought about. The thicker that line diameter, the less this bait actually gets to vibrate. And so when you're fishing a really heavy pound line around a really heavily pressured area, your bait's really not getting the action that it needs to have. And so that heavier line will actually take away from the action that your blade has. Instead of your blade actually vibrating, it's not going to have the full vibration power that you want, which could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. If you want to get the most action out of your bait, I like 14 to 17-pound test, depending on the type of cover that I'm fishing. If you're fishing really shallow, you might want to go to 20-pound test if you're fishing around really thick cover. You might even want to go to thin braided line, depending on how thick of cover that you're fishing around. But always make sure that you're fishing the right line for the setup that you're using in the area that you're fishing. So those of you guys that are running really stiff rods and really fast action rods, you might want to go to a little bit heavier pound test so that way you don't break those fish off. And likewise for you guys throwing moderate action rods, you might want to go to a little bit lighter pound test to be able to get the most action out of that bait. So one of my favorite baits that pairs really well with a chatterbait is going to be a swim jig. It is a great follow-up bait for when I've worked through an area with a chatterbait and want to see if I can't pick up a few more bites, I'll go to a swim jig. So if you learned a lot in today's video and you want to learn a little bit more about swim jigs, go ahead and check this video out where I'm going to explain everything about fall swim jig fishing that I think you guys need to know. Chatterbait is always a great way to catch some giant fish, just like that one fishing around this hard cover with some grass mixed in. But you gotta have the right gear in order to make it work. So make sure you're having the right gear and not using the same mistakes that I talked about in today's video. Thanks for watching. Y'all take care.